All right, what is going on, fellas? It has been a long day. Went to the gym in town. Everybody had questions for me, which is a good feeling that people care what I have to say about lifting weights. But goddamn, that was a lot more talking than I'm used to. So I'm a little bit mentally zapped. But we are going to do questions number 60. I've had the community post up for a little while. It's accumulated a lot of questions, and I have had Kirsten go through and pick what questions we're going to answer, and I'm going to have them. I'm going to have her read them to me. Figured this would be like a small little change in format that might feel like it's more engaging. So I don't know what the questions are necessarily ahead of time. I've read some of them, but I don't know which ones she picked. Question 1.
Will you ever release a beginner strength or strongman program, and would you ever consider writing a book about training?
I would absolutely consider writing a book about training. As arrogant as that feels to be like, yeah, I'm writing a book on how I train. I think that would be a good format for me to convey the amount of information that I think I would be happy putting my name on, which is kind of why I've strayed away from programs, because if it doesn't come with a whole ebook of like, hey, here are the other things you need to do alongside this program to make it effective, it feels like a bit of a sham. Not that it is a sham, not that there's anything wrong with the people that put programs out there, but if I'm going to put my name on something, I would like to be very confident. I'm like, hey, if you do this shit, it's going to work. And the problem with just a program is it's not tailored to the individual. There's not going to be that much instruction on how to adjust it to the individual unless it's got like a book alongside it. And it doesn't necessarily convey all of the other things that go into whether someone progresses that isn't just the numbers on a page. So a book is probably more likely than a program, though I could probably whip together like a how to train for strongman in like a regular commercial gym, because I know that's something that interests people. Is like, well, how can I emulate the kind of strength a strongman has if I don't have that stuff? I made a video on it. Nobody watched it because nobody watches strongman content, but I could drop a program for that type of thing. But the book thing is probably something I will do down the line and probably will need to do to diversify my income streams. Next question.
All right. I thought this was kind of funny. What are your favorite things to do besides train? What are your other hobbies or ways you like to spend your time?
Oh God, I don't have much time to do much other than my training, my eating, and my coaching. Coaching takes up the vast majority of my waking hours, whether that's like sending out voice messages, watching videos, updating spreadsheets, that type of deal. I like to go to the gym and hang out after I've trained. I'll train out in the garage, and then Kirsten will get back from work and we'll drive over to the gym in town and I'll just hang out there. But hanging out at the gym usually just turns into people asking me for some tips on lifting and doing the exact same thing I do all day. I like playing video games. I quite enjoy Pokemon, if you couldn't tell from the old YouTube little profile picture. Is there anything else I like to do?
MMA stuff.
Oh, I watch a lot of MMA. That's a good one. I totally forgot that. I actually literally right before we made this video, I just finished watching Sandhagen versus Vera, which was a bit of a snoozer, but I was really looking forward to that one. So yeah, I'd say that's my primary hobbies outside of lifting and coaching. I like playing some video games and I like watching MMA.
This one is from Bald Omni Man. Which do you prefer programming for your guys? 1, a top set auto-regulated by RPE and percentage-based backdowns, or 2, straight sets based on a 1RM where the reps per set are auto-regulated by RPE.
Okay, so for those of you that can't necessarily put together really quick what that would look like in practical application, I believe what Paris is asking is, would you rather say, okay, you're working up to a top 1 to 5 rep set at RPE 8, right? So we've got the RPE, we've got the reps, it's on us to find the weight, and then we use a percentage-based auto-regulated back-off, which is a very good system of training. Or do we say, okay, I've got a fixed weight that's based on a percentage. Let's just say we're in a hypertrophy phase, and we got like 67%. 4 sets, rep until roughly RPE 7. And I very much like both of these. I think they're great ways to include auto-regulation within your training.
Paris did say that he likes the first option better if he's working with a guy who has experience with it, but number 1 is still effective for people who haven't. While it's still effective for people who haven't used it, the second option is usually more foolproof.
Yeah, so I tend to agree with that. I think that finding a weight off of an RPE is something that advanced athletes are going to do pretty well. And they're going to benefit a lot from being able to regulate the load based on their fatigue coming into training and fit those parameters of what we think an effective training session would be. Because it's not necessarily about hitting exactly 465 pounds. It's more about, okay, well, we want to put in a set of 5 at roughly this difficulty. Because the general set and the difficulty is more about what's going to drive the progression than the exact number. So we have an idea of what an effective strength workout would be, and then the athlete can find, based on that day, based on their fatigue, what would fit those parameters. The problem is that newer athletes are very bad at finding that set at that fixed RPE, but the only way to get better at it is to do it. So that's kind of a toss-up, right? Is like, just because you're bad at it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, because we need to get better at finding a set at an RPE. But I really like the rep and till system, especially for a hypertrophy phase. If I just give someone a percentage between, let's say we're hypertrophy phase 60 to 75%, we progress from 60 to 75 over, let's say 4 weeks. I like giving people a load, and I say rep until roughly 2 to 3 RIR. I don't need this to be exact. I think when we get into later training phases, the precision needs to be higher, where the rep and till system gets a little dicey, because if we're all fired up, we're all adrenaline up, maybe we hit some smelling salts, our ability to determine when we hit RPE 9 and rack it kind of goes out the window, because we're busy focusing on lifting. But for something like a hypertrophy phase, I really like that, okay, hey, you got 115 on the bar, we're going to take it 5 times, rack it 2 to 3 RIR. Maybe we can rep out the last one to kind of audit whether you were accurate with the first 4, but usually we're trying to accumulate a lot of sets in the 6 to 10 range with anywhere from 4 to 1 RIR. So I like that system for hypertrophy phases. I use it almost exclusively for my athletes' hypertrophy phases. Then we kind of bifurcate our methodologies when we enter strength or peaking phases.
All right, thoughts on percentages versus evolving rep ranges for accessories. For example, dumbbell bench for 3 sets of 8 to 12 versus a Larson press for a 3x10 at 60%.
I would often think of those things differently, right? Where it's like, if it's something that we can use percentages, then it's probably a variation that's relatively close on the main lift. If you know what your 1RM on something is, and it's not something that's like kind of close to the main lifts, I don't know what you're doing necessarily. Maybe I couldn't think of an exercise off the top of my head, but like, you're not going to know what your dumbbell 1RM is, hopefully. I don't know if testing that is the safest thing in the world. But I guess it depends on what role we're trying to fill, right? If we are using this as our primary bench press for the day, I would absolutely, and we're in a hypertrophy phase, I would absolutely use the Larson press performed in like the 60 to 75 range. But if we've already done our main benching and the purpose of this exercise slot is purely more just building up the muscles that are relevant to being a big bencher, we close our eyes, we imagine, oh, what does a big bencher look like? Well, they got big pecs. Dumbbell bench press is a phenomenal pec exercise. So if it's something we're doing later in the workout, for almost like a micro bodybuilding workout for the muscles relevant to the bench press, I'm going to favor the dumbbell bench. But if it's going to be our primary bench press variation, so like it's like more sport specific training, and like for that first half of the session, I'm going to lean towards the Larson. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but I'm going to program percentages for the one that's a primary lift, and I'm going to probably program like target rep range system for something that's an accessory. Kirsten gave me a big nod. That must have been a really good answer.
How best to go about training when you care equally about strength, but also looking like a bodybuilder? Talking about just general strength, not necessarily powerlifting specific. Would you do them concurrently or have different phases of training?
So for your things that you view as your strength metrics, so like let's say you care about your strength on squats and deadlifts and benches and pull-ups. Let's just pick those 4. You could pick a different couple of exercises. Those are probably going to be periodized. There's going to be periods of training where you are training those for more hypertrophy focused rep ranges. And then there's going to be periods of time where we move into strength and peaking phases. But there's probably going to be a background amount of hypertrophy focused work kind of year round. Maybe if we're testing our max towards the end of a training cycle, the week leading up to the test, we might drop off those little bodybuilding workouts to be a little bit fresher and test our max. But for most of the year, year, we're going to have this constant background hypertrophy stimulus. Whether your goal is, I'm kind of power building, I've got this mix of bodybuilding and strength training goals, or if our goal is just strength training, one of the biggest predictors of how much force your muscle can output is how big the muscle is cross-sectionally. So basically, none of us have any excuse not to be training to try to get bigger muscles most of the year, unless you're absolutely topping out your weight class. So we're going to have this background bodybuilding the whole time, either way, and that's something you're going to be doing. But those main lifts, yes, they're going to be periodized. That background stuff, we could periodize within like hypertrophy relevant rep ranges. Like maybe we start in those higher reps, like 15 to 20, and then in a strength phase, we're in 8 to 12. Then 5 to 8. If we want to periodize that bodybuilding work, we could, though I don't think it's a necessity. I do think rotating the rep ranges can be good, but it doesn't need to be that, it's not that important. And so, but primarily the biggest thing is if you are training for a strength sport and then you're also very diligent with your diet as a bodybuilder might be, you're going to end up having a pretty good look to you if you're paying attention to that as well. And you place some focus in dieting in such a way that you maintain body fat where you want, you're probably going to look pretty decent from the muscle that you've put on by accident from your strength training goals.
I like this question.
Not on accident, but...
Do you think that high sets with low reps have the same hypertrophy stimulus as low reps with high sets, 10 by 3 and 3 by 10, for example?
So there's some studies on this. The study that I'm familiar with increased the load for the 10 by 3, and then it ended up being more stimulative because the total workload was higher, right? The 3 by 10, let's say it was 135, but then the 10 by 3 is a 185. The sum workload seemed to be the most important thing. But there, I don't think anybody absolutely knows the response to this perfectly, like to what degree they're going to differ, because some people follow the effective reps hypothesis, which is that the reps, let's say 4 away from failure and closer, are the reps that have a more significant drive of hypertrophy. So that's why people might do something like myo reps, where we rep until failure, we take 10 breaths, and then we rep again. And the idea is we're able to accumulate more of these effective reps, the reps that are close to failure. And those are the stimulative reps. And then some other people might say, well, no, I think it's really the sum workload that's probably the biggest driver, in which case you would say, okay, well then the 8 by 3 and the 3 by 8, if the load is the same, is probably going to be near identical. I think that there's probably some amount of growth that's driven by those reps closer to failure, whether that be due to damage to the muscle or whether that be due to localized metabolite buildups, maybe being an independent driver of hypertrophy. I would say that the 3 by 8, assuming the load's the same, is going to be a little bit more stimulative, though the 8 sets of 3 is still going to have a stimulus to drive your body forward and not just strength. There's going to be some demand for growth created by that workout. It probably wouldn't be how I approached it if my only goal was hypertrophy, though, because I do think we're probably missing out on something, though I'm not willing to hang my hat on it and tell you guys that's a fact.
All right. What are your opinions on concurrent training versus block training? In triphasic training, it's stated that concurrent training will get mediocre returns as compared to blocks, as your body will be confused as to which quality you want it to adapt to. That said, guys like Brian Alzru and a lot of strongmen seem to train multiple qualities simultaneously and get fantastic results. Do you think they are just outliers, or that the assertion from triphasic is an overstatement?
Okay, so first little thing here, we're just going to include this for anybody that might get confused. Triphasic can will be sometimes used to refer to 2 different things. The first being breaking your training into eccentric, isometric, concentric, right? Where for one phase of training, we focus on the negative. One phase of training, we focus on isometric contractions. And then one is concentric contraction. So the 3 different types of muscle contraction. We periodize our training into focusing on these different things. That's something you'll see in the more the sports performance world. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm presuming that's not what he's talking about either. I could be wrong here. He might be saying, okay, well, more of a traditional block periodization of hypertrophy phase, strength phase, peaking phase, where we're focusing on these different physical qualities for this couple of weeks here is hypertrophy, this couple of weeks here is strength, this couple of weeks here is peaking. And he mentioned how there are some athletes that are trying to address all 3 of these qualities each week. So they're training for all 3 at once. Now, it's a really important caveat here that most programs are going to actually end up being concurrent because during the strength phase, you're probably still doing some of your accessory work. That means there's also a focus on hypertrophy. Some athletes will still have a top single present in their hypertrophy phase. Yes, the emphasis is shifting, but we're not training solely for that. So I think most modern powerlifting programs could be described as concurrent in that way, in that most people are handling like top singles a lot of the year due to sport specificity, and most people are handling background hypertrophy work for the majority of the year due to the importance of cross-sectional area. So even modern programs that are performing very well and outperforming lifters of the past, I would say they still are concurrent to some degree. So this idea that, we can only do one of these at once, or we're going to get this brutal interference effect, and we're going to chase two rabbits, and we're going to catch neither of them, I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think a program devoid of periodization is going to perform quite as well, though. Right? If we go omega concurrent, where each thing is a equal emphasis at all times, because like I said, we're going to train for multiple of them at once, but there's going to be an emphasis on different qualities at different times based on our proximity to competition. And I think that's how it should be, and that's pretty well documented within the preparation of other sports that are probably a little bit ahead of us in, let's say, powerlifting and strongman. With a lot more proper research behind it, something like weightlifting, periodization does kind of emerge, though there is this kind of background concurrence. I would say something when we get completely devoid and we go full, all three qualities, full throttle year round, I think it can work if we manage our fatigue well, though it's hard to do, but it can be done and it can be structured in a way that's effective. But I think that it's going to be a really well done, full on, full throttle concurrent will probably be outperformed and more sustainable, and less sustainable than a well-performed, more like block periodized training. Maybe that's just my bias, but that would be my thoughts. I think Brian's a great athlete. I like Brian, but I think maybe he could have benefited from a greater degree of emphasis of different qualities through time and maybe a little bit better fatigue management. But he's a mental hoss, so it doesn't matter.
What shoulder mobility exercises have you done that actually work?
Does he say anything else there? Like for what?
He just said that the internet has a lot of all kinds of different ones. He just was looking for some direction towards.
Yeah, I guess it really just depends on what shoulder mobility task you need. Like what do you need mobility for? I think that banded over and backs, I mentioned that in my little squat mobility routine, are simple and you can do them consistently. And the biggest thing is doing something consistently for a long time. Then we're going to start to see the effect. It might not always be, I do this one time and it either worked or it didn't. We might need to repeat that. And something like an over and back, I just keep a band in my bag and I do 20 over and backs. And that has made a difference to apply that very consistently in my day-to-day life. Just like the third world squats being done every day is what got me the results. I like over and backs. There are some good lat stretches. They can be very helpful for getting a good overhead position. I think the best mobility for a front rack position is probably just very specific front rack holds where we're pressing up into the bar, gradually easing ourselves into position. I think the biggest thing is it just comes down to what task do you need mobility for. But as far as general, I like the over and backs.
It's probably related to his next question, which is, what would be your recommended dumbbell overhead press form? Modifications to avoid impingement.
I don't think you necessarily need modification. I think that when you overhead press, your scaps need to rotate upward. This, I feel confident telling you. I'm sure you guys have noticed, I don't like putting out hard, cold statements because there's always a chance I'm wrong. I'm a person who is dumb. But I can tell you with confidence that when we put our arms over our head, our scaps need to rotate upward, right? So things can get a little bit janky if we're cueing back and down and we're using muscles to restrict the ability of our scaps to rotate upward. So the first thing I would tell you is, hey, don't crank your scaps back and down like you might on a bench press. Some people would say, well, don't do it on a bench press either. Well, tons of people do that without any issue. So it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Because just because you're cueing down and back doesn't mean that you're doing a great job restricting all scapular movement. So cueing doesn't equal reality. So that's why some people benefit from cueing back and down. And some people, they're like, that hurts my shoulder. I need to have some amount of protraction, retraction. So first and foremost, the cue isn't what determines the effectiveness of the cue. It's how it's interpreted. Rambling aside. What was
He was asking if
overhead press form. So the scaps need to rotate upward. So hey, don't cue down and back. That's number one. Some people have a very hard time just because they haven't spent very much in an overhead position. So that's why you'll hear some people say shrug at the top. You don't necessarily need to shrug at the top. Some people never shrug at the top and never have any issues with their shoulders, but flexing those upper traps can be a good way to cue, hey, let's learn to upward rotate the scap. It's not necessary, but something like overhead shrugs with a bar over our head can help us train the muscles, right? Because this kind of gets to the other thing, right? So we don't want to cue down and back. And some people, because they haven't spent very much time working in the overhead plane, the muscles that rotate the scap upward are maybe a little bit undertrained. That's why overhead gets junky. Well, overhead pressing, gradually easing into it, is going to strengthen these muscles, but we can also do some supplemental work to strengthen these muscles as well. Things like overhead shrugs, things like face pulls, things like IYT raises that are going to strengthen all these upper back muscles that are going to help our scaps rotate upward could help. And then the other thing is, again, if someone hasn't spent very much time in an overhead position, right, we maybe have this detraining effect of the muscles that rotate upward, so we got to get those built up. Maybe we do cue shrugging when we overhead press, and then the muscles that kind of pull these scaps down don't have much strength in this stretched position. So they're kind of restricting on the underside the ability of the scaps to rotate upward. And the thing that you can do to help with this is just dead hangs from a bar. Probably use straps so we can just focus on kind of letting the lat stretch out. But if you have problems with your overhead position, one of the best possible things you can do, again, because simplicity probably leads to greater adherence, is going to be just doing hangs from a bar. So I would say, like, if I wanted the simplest, like, shoulder mobility routine I could think of, probably just be hangs and over and backs.
Nice. What sort of training style would you like to pursue for the rest of your life? Once you're 50 plus years old and your athletic prime and achievements slow down, would you still just keep doing strongman style training as you get older?
I would probably, I'm going guaranteed to continue doing strength training. If, let's say we break training into, we've got pushing, we've got pulling, we've got squatting, we've got hinging, we've got carrying. If, let's say, something like a sandbag pick is causing me discomfort in my hinging category, and I'm not competing, I'll probably just swap that to a different hinge. If back squatting, my shoulders are shot, I'll switch that to front squatting. I'll try to hit those core 5 variables of training, but I'm not going to be as tied to specific movements that fit those categories as I might be now. I probably, when I am no longer doing strongman, I plan to never do strongman again. I'm probably not going to do a lot of yoke. I would rather, maybe I'll Zercher carry the yoke, but I'm not doing yokes from the back position, mostly because I don't want to. And I can fit that category other ways. And probably when I hit about 40 years old, that seems to be roughly the age that you really need to downsize. If you're a very large person, even if it's predominantly muscle, staying too heavy too late seems to correlate with a massive increased risk of cardiac event. I've kind of observationally said that's 40. That even might be pushing it a little bit, but staying really heavy past 40 is not something I probably should do. So I'll probably take up combat sports again. That way I've got an incentive to be lighter. I'll be doing something that rewards being lighter. That way I can get over the fact that I'm not as big and strong as I once was. Well, I'm doing this to get better at an activity. So I'll get back into that. Obviously I will do my strength training on top of that, but that's kind of the plan I have in my head, because I really, really enjoy combat sports. So I don't think it'll be hard to sell myself on that and just get my identity vested back into a different form of training where cardiovascular health and being lighter is prioritized.
All right, this is a popular one. Strategies for program adaptation when you have limited resources. This means either getting stronger while working a physically demanding job, or getting stronger while having maybe something like an hour of time 4 times a week.
So I would say those are kind of different, right? So if we have an hour of time 4 times a week, we really want to make sure that time is spent. I mean, I guess this applies to both. If you've got those very limited recovery resources, you can't afford to use the kitchen sink approach. You can't say, oh, I want to increase my deadlift. I'm going to do every single exercise I can think of that might have a marginal improvement to my deadlift. Someone who's got the recovery capabilities and they're really focused on one goal, throwing the kitchen sink at something works pretty good. You're like, okay, well, I do curls because they've got this maybe marginal benefit in the bench press. And then I train my forearms to make sure that I've got maximum stability in the bench press. And I do this for my upper back. And I do every single thing that I think might have a marginal improvement. I'm going to do that. And that's why bench specialists get so goddamn good, aside from the extra training economy they free. I mean, I guess it is the extra training economy can be used in all of these little marginal benefits. If we have a limited amount of time in the gym, or we have very limited recovery capabilities, we really need to identify what things are probably moving the needle on our goal more than other things. Now, traditionally, most people would tell you that's going to be, hey, let's bias towards bigger compounds in our training because we're going to hit more muscles effectively at the same time. And we can use it in such a way that it cuts down on training time. Something like, hey, instead of doing like a few sets of lat pull downs and some curls, how about we just bust ass on limited rest intervals for heavy neutral chins? So that'd be the first thing, is if you're on limited time, we really want to identify which things are moving the needle and then go hard and do a lot of work on those things rather than this kitchen sink approach. And then if we are someone who has a physical job, a lot of that's just, you have to take better care of yourself than you would otherwise. You have to take it more seriously drinking your water. You have to take it more seriously making sure you have a plan for your meals, and you have to take your sleep more seriously than someone else your level would, right? Someone else your strength level who's just kind of living like a bum college lifestyle. Not that all kids in college are bums, but some are, right? They're kind of like, all I care about is training. I don't give a shit about my classes. Everything can revolve around training. Well, they could probably progress to your level of strength without these great outside the gym variables. But to keep your performance in the gym consistent session to session and really make good adaptation, we got to give the body everything it needs. And we could say, oh, woe is me, or we could just do it, right? Make sure you have a plan for your meals. Make sure you have a plan for your water. Get as much sleep as you can. Yeah, there's going to be days where training takes a bit of a hit due to work and outside, you have no way to control what your workload was at work. Maybe we auto-regulate a bit. But the biggest thing is just to take really good care of your body, to give it the amount of resources it would need to make the adaptations and not just barely keep up. And same kind of principles about, hey, let's identify the things that are really moving the needle and hammer those.
Just checking our time here. Awesome. Do you ever experience knee discomfort when introducing push presses? It stopped me from consistently programming them, and I want to know if it's a common problem or an issue with my technique.
It's both, right? So it's if we're like dynamically reversing weight in this shallow position, that's not really like squatting. We haven't built up a lot of tolerance there. So if you go straight into hammering volume on a push press, you're probably going to piss off your patellar tendon. Something like jumping in your training is a good way to kind of build that capacity in the knees, easing into it with the specific training. A lot of people will experience, I would say, additional stress on their knees because of two things. One, the weight distribution in their feet is very poor. At the bottom of their dip and drive, they're losing the weight off of their heels. It's dumping into their forefeet. So we want to make sure that we get really good at maintaining even pressure front to back in the feet. The easiest way to work on this is to do pauses at the bottom of your dip and drive and make sure we're establishing a good position. Most people dip deeper than they actually should be. If you look at a lot of the best push presses, they're not getting this crazy deep dip and drive. If you watch Klokov's 500, probably the best push press ever done, the dip is not crazy deep to like, oh, I'm going to go further down and get more out of my quads. The best people getting the most out of their leg drive are usually using a bit shallower and bad control of the knees. So unilateral leg work can also help build up that quad, build up those patellar tendons, but also develop better control of the knees. Jumping can also help to condition, the tendons and ligaments of your knees, because when you jump, you're actually exposing your knees to pretty significant tonnages. So they do drive some good ligament tendon adaptation there. But the biggest thing is, hey, you're doing something, you're loading explosively a position you haven't loaded much. Because you've got strong legs from squatting, you're going to be able to do more than you've kind of earned the right to do. So easing into it and allowing your body to make those slow adaptations to this explosive power output in a position you haven't really loaded all that much. Those would be kind of just what comes to the top of my head.
Okay, I think I'm probably just going to pick a couple more because I think we're at like 30 minutes.
Cool.
For someone who is interested in powerlifting and strongman, would the approach to first focus on 2 to 3 years of powerlifting and then incorporate a strongman event training be better than starting with quote-unquote strongman training?
It just depends on what you mean by quote-unquote strongman training. It's probably not best to start with hyper-specific strongman training because strongman, just like powerlifting, right, the amount of specificity needed to get better increases as you get more advanced. And what I like to tell people is I think that you should use that as an opportunity to have your specificity fairly low when you're newer. When you can get away with low specificity, let's try to build all of these different physical qualities. Let's do a bigger range of exercises and kind of develop our body from a whole lot of angles and then only increase that specificity as it's needed to get better. So I think if you just jumped into nothing but event training for your next show and you were not doing all of these other general developmental exercises, that would not be great. That being said, powerlifting is not the best base for strongman. Strongman is the best base for strongman. So there's no reason to wait to begin developing event skill and the special strength associated. I just wouldn't make it everything of your training. I would have this constant background, more traditional strength training. We could call that powerlifting, but maybe we squat high bar. Maybe we do front squats because I think those are quite helpful for strongman. Maybe we're putting a little bit more emphasis on our weighted chin up than a powerlifter might because our upper body pulling muscles are probably a little bit more important to our general development for our sport. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily powerlifting, though we can draw a lot from powerlifting for just what effective general strength training looks like. But we pick, okay, well, these are our core developmental exercises. These develop our body in a way that we imagine is going to correlate with being a good strongman. And then we do a bit of event training on top of that to begin developing that skill and learn all these tips and tricks early. But we shouldn't be doing so much event training that we neglect to kind of grow the organism via these effective general training means.
It's hard to pick questions. They're all so good. There's also a question for Max.
She says all of your questions are good.
I'll try to remember the Max question for large lads tomorrow.
Cool.
If mid-block fatigue is rising too high, too fast, would it be better to end the block early and start a new block, or should you cut down on enough accessories to at least slowly progress on main lifts until the scheduled end of the block, or perhaps take a mini deload mid-block?
I think the mini deload is a perfectly good idea. Let's say I'm halfway through my strength phase and I've kind of overaccumulated fatigue at like a rate greater than what I was expecting. This idea that a deload needs to be a week in duration, I think, is a bit silly, and people can decay a reasonable amount of their fatigue reasonably quickly, mostly because most people are not strong enough that they're able to dig this massively deep hole that they need to get out of. So I think for a lot of athletes, half a week of dialed back training is enough to drop back some fatigue and then kind of pick up without much detraining effect. So yeah, I think that's perfectly appropriate. I mean, depending on your goals, if you're just like, I'm going to finish out this strength phase and then I'm going to roll into a new hypertrophy phase. I know I'm over fatigued to enter a peaking phase, but I don't really care about peaking right now. I'm just trying to build up my base. I'm trying to alternate between hypertrophy qualities, strength qualities, and I'll leave that peaking for later because I know I'm usually pretty good for a 1RM. If you're someone who's shit for a 1RM and you're really good for reps, I don't think opting out of your peaking phase practice often is a great idea. That's why I have athletes do like pseudo, not a true comp style, but a pseudo peaking phase in training, because that's the sport. We need to practice the sport sometimes. And while for me, it's not year round, we're going to practice the sport in training, and that is upper end singles. But if you're really good at it, good at singles, you always like, I outlift my projected maxes every time. We can opt out of those. But if you're someone who's like, I can take 90% for a set of 8, fuck no. You probably need to be practicing some upper end even during your strength phases and maybe even during your hypertrophy phases.
I don't know what this means, but there are a lot of likes on it. Is a good chest expander worth it? It seems old school bodybuilders got shredded rear delts and made upper backs with them. However, a good one costs about $200. Put differently, compared to just doing normal upper back, rear delt work, seal rows, T-races, etc., do chest expanders offer a unique benefit?
I mean, chest expanders are just really heavy bands, effectively. And yeah, there's some unique benefit to accommodating resistance. But as far as developing the upper back goes, no, I don't think. I think that if you bust ass on more traditional upper back movements, as you said, no, I don't think that there's anything that the chest expander is going to do for you in terms of muscular development of your upper back that couldn't be achieved through other exercises. There's nothing magical about that in particular. You know, if we're doing like rear delts, we're doing face pulls, we're doing seal rows, I love Powell raises. If you don't know what a Powell raise is, imagine I'm like lying on my side on a bench press. I have a dumbbell in my upper hand. I come across the body and then I come up. And it's basically a way to load a bit more of a stretch position on a rear delt fly, but using dumbbells. I think they're great. They keep my shoulders feeling awesome. I like them quite a bit. If we're doing a bunch of stuff like that and we're working really hard, I don't think working equivalently hard on the chest expander would do any more.
All right. Do you need to have hypertrophy phases, or is training in the strength ranges enough, 1 to 5, to stimulate the needed muscle growth for strength gains? You kind of already answered this, but...
Yeah, I mean, there's some athletes that do not like performing. Let's say you're talking about power. If you're talking about general strength training, I like taking whatever my strength metric is into hypertrophy-centric ranges. If I'm training for a 1RM weighted chin-up, There will be phases where I'm working in the 6 to 10 range. If I'm training for a high bar squat, I will be working in the 6 to 10 range. Some people find that when they specialize their technique to maximize like competitive results, that training competition movement itself becomes a not very helpful part of their hypertrophy training. So imagine someone who has a big arch. Imagine someone who has a very low bar, wide stance squat, right? To where these become less good hypertrophic development exercises. When that happens to someone, what they'll usually do is they'll basically commit that main lift to strength training year round and then use exercises that better direct the fatigue as background hypertrophy work. So they'll have phases of training that are still a hypertrophy phase where they're doing a little bit less strength work and they've got more training economy to devote to those better directed accessories. So maybe they're going to be doing, okay, well, I do some almost like maintenance level strength work on my low bar squat, and then I go ham on some high bars and some belt squats. Something like that might be their phase. Just depends on your technique that you're you're using for the heavy singles. Is it still something that works as a good developmental exercise? And so we can just train it for higher repetitions to prepare for it? Or is it something that, okay, well, you've gotten super efficient with this. I don't even want to make this point because it's super underdeveloped and I probably could articulate it a lot better, but it's something like a snatch where we're getting to extreme levels of technical proficiency. There's these really important power qualities. It makes it so that it is not a good exercise to use for a hypertrophy phase. It's important to maintain those speed qualities. It's important to maintain technique, and drilling broken down technique is probably not a great use of time. So it's better to stay in these more specific phases on that movement and then use other exercises as our general development tools. There's a whole lot of reasons why doing snatches for sets of 8 isn't probably a great hypertrophy phase for a weightlifter. But I digress.
All right, last question because Ode is yelling at me. Do you think it's best to be your leanest before a hypertrophy phase? I've heard people like Kino Body talk about how you can see a greater boost in lean mass because testosterone is higher when you're at your leanest.
So testosterone is not higher when you're at your leanest, right? There's individual variability, but when you get past a certain point of leanness, testosterone is going to go down. That's pretty well documented. When we probably get past a certain level of adiposity, a certain level of body fat, it also goes down. So there's this optimal range, and it could be taken too far. So just saying the leaner you are, the more test you have is a bit silly. And the way people want to look, a lot of the time is past that barrier where if you were natural, it's going to have some negative hormonal impacts, right? The guys you follow on Instagram largely are not natural, right? So they can stay down at these insanely low body fats for extended periods of time without dealing of the negative repercussion of their test crashing because they get their test from a bottle. So I don't think the leaner you are, the better your bulk is automatically, especially for like natural athletes. So I don't really want to talk about Kino Body. I don't really care what he has to say, to be perfectly honest. I will say it's kind of interesting. If you guys are familiar with the space, I'm sure you've heard. Oh God, it's trying to knock over the camera. I'm sure you've heard this idea of like nutrient partitioning, right? When you're leaner, weight you gain is more likely to be muscle than the same weight gained under the same circumstances if you were fatter.
Sorry.
People like Stan Efferding have been like big proponents. Tons of people have been big proponents of this, which is just like, hey, it's harder to gain muscle the fatter you are. And recently I saw Greg Nuckols on a podcast mention, he's like, hey, I'm not saying that isn't true, but we state that like it's a fact. Where is the solid evidence we have for that? And I was just like, oh shit, I have no idea. I have not read it. Maybe it's out there. But I think he had said he hadn't really seen anything that was like really robust that supported that idea. And that's not to say that it's not true, because lots of people anecdotally swear by it. It might just have been something that's never been funded. Maybe something that's never been investigated. But I do think it's interesting that we've always tossed that around as this is an indisputable fact that nutrient partitioning is better. I don't know. I'm going to go with yes. In practical application, I think that the people are going to have much better energy levels. They're going to be able to do a lot more training, and that's going to translate to more muscle gain. And they're going to have they're going to be more adherent to the habits you want to have to gain muscle when they're not excessively fat. And they get those detriments to their energy levels. Their habits are going to get worse. So it could be a pretty multifactorial thing, but I do think that maintaining some semblance of a reasonable body fat while you bulk is a very, very good idea. One other way we could look at it other than body fat is also I like to make sure that my guys, when they're like, hey, I want to go up weight class, I'm like, awesome. You cannot slip below a certain level of base aerobic conditioning. If you're going to be eating in a surplus, I would like to have you doing at least a bit of dedicated conditioning work where we can pay attention to, oh shit, I'm getting in bad shape, or oh shit, I'm in pretty good shape. Let me keep pushing the calories. I feel like a fucking machine. So I guess that's kind of unrelated. There is no cut and dry answer. Like, oh, you need to bulk in this range. And people are constantly asking on the internet of like, when, like, do I bulk or cut, or do I bulk or cut, or, you know, what is the ideal range? And it varies. There are people that work within a larger range and it works great for them and it has no negative psychological impacts. And then there are people that work within a smaller range and it works well for them and has no negative psychological impacts. And then there are some people that bulk for too big of a range and it's fucking them over. And there's some people that bulk in too small of a range where every time they gain any weight, they get panic and they cut, and it's working against them. So it can be done a lot of different ways. It can fit to the individual. Yeah, there's some general parameters of probably, unless we're trying to get ready for a bodybuilding show or a photo shoot, we shouldn't come down past a certain point, or we shouldn't go up past a certain point that's pretty far. But there's no cut and dry answer. The biggest thing I can give you guys is, hey, don't let yourself get out of shape. If you're going to be a fat guy, be a fat guy that's in like pretty good shape. That's a good aspiration. If you're bulking up and you're like, I just want to be a big hoss. Be a big hoss that's in good shape. Your training is going to go better. I promise. That's not just, oh, I just care about you guys having a heart attack. No, I'm a meathead. I care about the numbers on the bar. Heart attacks doesn't matter. I'm telling you that if you stay in good shape, you're going to be able to handle more good training. You're going to be able to focus better, and you're going to get better results from your training. This isn't even, like, you can't just tell me like, oh, Sam, I'm badass. I don't give a shit about my heart attack. Like, I'm just going to go for it. Like perma-bulk gang, and you use that as an excuse to eat like a fat slob instead of eating what you're supposed to be eating, and then you get in really bad shape, and your training does not go that well. Your work capacity goes down. The amount of effective work you can do in the gym goes down. Keep in good shape. If you're going to be a fat guy, be a fat guy in good shape. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate you. If you made it this far, leave a thank you, Kirsten. We're going to have her be the one who's picking the questions for these going forward. So she's going to have some fun picking, like, seeing which questions you guys like answered, which ones you don't like answered. So any feedback you have for Kirsten, we're going to read it, because Kirsten's just going to see if we can pump up the views a little bit, because she's smarter than I am.
And maybe we'll try to answer some of the ones we didn't get to either next time, or maybe we'll just go type some responses, or maybe even if they're large lads type questions, we can do that too.
For sure. Thank you boys for watching. I appreciate you.